Robert Wagner has been named a person of interest in the death of his wife, legendary actress Natalie.
There are moments in Hollywood that time refuses to bury. Stories whispered in studio hallways, questions that never found answers, and the kind of pain that even fame can't disguise. For Robert Wagner, one of the most beloved actors of his generation, that pain is deeply personal. Decades of success, countless interviews, and an entire lifetime under the bright lights. Yet there's one subject he's never touched, one truth he's never dared to share: his daughter. Those close to him say it's a silence born not of secrecy, but of sorrow. Behind the polished smiles and the charming presence lies a wound that never healed, a private heartbreak that changed the way he looked at family, fame, and life itself. Every time journalists tried to bring her name into conversation, Wagner's eyes would cloud, his posture would shift, and the interview would turn. "Next question," he'd say, softly but firmly, and that was the end of it. Rumors spread. Some said it was guilt. Others claimed it was grief. But the truth, as with much in Wagner's life, is more complex, a mix of love, loss, and a story too painful to revisit. Now, decades later, fans are beginning to piece together fragments of what really happened. What drove one of Hollywood's most charismatic men into a lifelong vow of silence? And what role did tragedy, the kind that changes everything, play in it all? This is not a story about scandal. It's a story about a father's heartbreak, a haunting past, and the silence that speaks louder than any words ever could. Would you like me to start with Chapter 1, 750 words, next, The Golden Years, when Robert Wagner had it all? Before tragedy and whispers clouded his legacy, Robert Wagner was the embodiment of classic Hollywood charm. Born in Detroit in 1930, he had the kind of movie star looks that seemed almost designed for the silver screen. Strong jawline, piercing blue eyes, and a confidence that came as naturally as breathing. When he arrived in Los Angeles as a young man, Hollywood took one look at him and saw potential written all over his face. By the 1950s, Wagner had become one of the brightest stars under the 20th Century Fox banner. His early films like With a Song in My Heart and Beneath the 12-Mile Reef showcased not just his talent, but a magnetic presence that made audiences lean in a little closer. He wasn't just another handsome leading man. He had depth, vulnerability, and a quiet sincerity that made people believe every word he spoke on screen. As his fame grew, so did his circle. Hollywood's biggest names called him a friend. He shared tables with legends like Clark Gable, Cary Grant, and Spencer Tracy. Off camera, he was charming, thoughtful, and funny. The kind of man everyone wanted to know, and every woman wanted to dance with. Then came Natalie Wood. Their love story began like something out of a studio romance. Two young stars, both adored by millions drawn together by fate and glamour. She was one of the most luminous actresses of her time, known for her roles in Rebel Without a Cause and West Side Story. Together, they were the golden couple of Hollywood, picture perfect, always smiling, the embodiment of success and beauty. But beneath the glitter, real emotions ran deep. Friends said Wagner adored her, that when he looked at Natalie, he saw not just a movie star, but his entire world. They married in 1957, a dazzling affair that filled headlines and melted hearts. For a time, it seemed they had everything: fame, fortune, and love that felt destined to last forever. Yet Hollywood has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. Fame brings pressure, rumors spread, schedules clash. The same lights that once illuminated their joy began to cast long shadows. The couple divorced in 1962, both heartbroken but determined to move on. For Wagner, the next few years were a blur of work and reinvention. He starred in hit shows like It Takes a Thief and Switch, cementing his place as one of television's most beloved leading men. The charm never faded, but those who knew him best said something had changed. A quiet melancholy lingered behind the smile. Then, as fate would have it, Natalie came back into his life. The two reunited in the early 1970s, older, wiser, and convinced that love deserved a second chance. They remarried in 1972, and this time, it seemed like the fairy tale might truly have its happy ending. Together, they blended their families and built a home filled with laughter, music, and the warmth of second chances. When their daughter Courtney was born, Wagner's world shifted once more. He was no longer just the actor, the star, or the husband. He was a father, fiercely protective and endlessly proud. Those close to the family recall how his face lit up whenever she entered the room. "She's my little miracle," he often said. To the outside world, Robert Wagner had it all: fame, fortune, and a family he cherished more than anything. But behind that perfect picture, the clock was quietly ticking toward a night that would shatter everything. No one could have predicted that the man who once symbolized Hollywood's golden age would soon find himself surrounded by suspicion, sorrow, and a silence that would follow him for the rest of his life. It all began with a boat, a storm, and a tragedy that remains one of Hollywood's most haunting mysteries. It was the weekend after Thanksgiving, November 1981, a time when most families were gathered around fireplaces, sharing leftovers and laughter. For Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood, it was supposed to be the same: a brief getaway to Catalina Island aboard their yacht, the Splendor. They invited actor Christopher Walken, Natalie's co-star from Brainstorm, to join them. The plan was simple: relax, enjoy the water, and forget the pressures of Hollywood for a few days. But what began as a quiet weekend among friends ended as one of the most mysterious tragedies in show business history. The weather that night was restless. The sea rocked against the sides of the boat, and the winds carried an unease that no one could quite explain. On board were 4 people: Natalie, Robert, Christopher Walken, and the ship's captain, Dennis Davern. By the next morning, only 3 would remain. According to the official reports, Natalie disappeared sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight. Her body was found the next morning, floating face down near a dinghy about a mile from the yacht. She was wearing a red down jacket, and her death was ruled an accidental drowning. But almost no one believed it was that simple. From the very beginning, questions swirled. How could an experienced swimmer like Natalie fall into the water and drown? Why was the dinghy untied? And why did no one on board seem to know exactly when or how she vanished? The story of that night has been retold countless times, yet the truth remains shrouded in fog. Some say there had been an argument: raised voices, broken glass, and tears. The yacht's captain, Dennis Davern, later claimed that tension between Natalie and Robert had been rising all evening. There were rumors of jealousy, fueled by Natalie's close friendship with Walken. Wagner had reportedly been drinking, as had everyone on board, and emotions ran high. In his memoir, Pieces of My Heart, Wagner later admitted that there had been a heated exchange that night, not just between him and Natalie, but also with Walken. There was no fight, no anger, he wrote, but there was tension, and that tension was something I wish I could take back forever. What happened after that is where the accounts diverge. Some say Natalie left the cabin, perhaps to get some air, perhaps to calm herself down. Others believe she went to secure the dinghy, which had been banging against the side of the yacht. The sea was dark, the wind sharp. One wrong step, one slip on the wet deck, and disaster could strike, but others weren't convinced it was an accident. Too many details didn't add up. The bruises found on her body, the unexplained timing, the silence that followed, they all fueled decades of speculation. When the Coast Guard arrived, Robert Wagner appeared shattered. Witnesses described him as pale, trembling, and unable to speak. He identified Natalie's body with tears streaming down his face, whispering her name again and again. The love of his life, the woman he had married twice, was gone forever. In the days that followed, the media descended like a storm. Headlines screamed of mystery, jealousy, and tragedy. Paparazzi camped outside his home, and every television station in America repeated the same haunting question: what really happened that night? Through it all, Robert Wagner stayed silent. He spoke only once through a brief statement. The loss of my beloved Natalie is something words cannot describe. I ask only for privacy and understanding as our family grieves. That silence, born of grief, perhaps also of guilt, would become a defining part of his life. He never took another interview about that night, never revisited Catalina, and never publicly discussed the pain that followed. For the world, Natalie Wood's death became one of Hollywood's greatest unsolved mysteries. For Robert Wagner, it became a wound that never healed, a moment frozen in time, replayed endlessly in the minds of fans, investigators, and journalists. And as the years passed, that silence only grew louder. In the days following Natalie Wood's death, Robert Wagner's world fell apart. What had been a glamorous life built on charm, talent, and devotion turned into a relentless storm of grief and suspicion. The press swarmed outside his Los Angeles home, flashing cameras and shouting questions he refused to answer. Inside, the house was silent, not just from mourning, but from the weight of what had been lost. Wagner buried Natalie in a private ceremony at Westwood Village Memorial Park. Hollywood's biggest names attended: Elizabeth Taylor, Frank Sinatra, Laurence Olivier, Gregory Peck. In the months that followed, he withdrew from the public eye. His once bright and charming demeanor turned quiet, almost haunted. Friends who visited said he barely spoke of Natalie, not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't. Every word about her felt like reopening a wound that would never heal. When Pieces of My Heart, his memoir, was released years later, readers noticed how carefully he wrote about her. His words were full of tenderness and regret, yet they were wrapped in restraint. He confessed that Natalie's death had left him in pieces, but he offered no explanations, no theories, only heartbreak. "There are no words," he wrote, "for the emptiness that kind of loss leaves behind." Still, the world demanded answers. In 2011, 30 years after Natalie's death, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the case, citing new information. Captain Dennis Davern, the yacht's skipper, gave interviews suggesting that Wagner hadn't told the full truth. He claimed he heard arguing before Natalie went missing, and that Wagner delayed calling for help. The news reignited public interest. Reporters dug up old files, documentaries were made, and talk shows dissected every theory imaginable. Wagner, then in his 80s, was suddenly thrust back into a nightmare he had spent decades trying to escape. When asked for comment, his lawyer released a simple statement: "Mr. Wagner has cooperated fully and continues to grieve the loss of his wife. He has no further comment." Again, silence. Behind that silence, however, was a man trying to live a life that no longer belonged entirely to him. Every time he appeared at an event, every interview he gave, someone would eventually bring up Natalie, and each time his expression would change, the light in his eyes dimming just a little more. Still, Wagner tried to move forward. He continued to act, appearing in television shows and films, including a memorable role in the Austin Powers series. Younger generations came to know him as the suave number 2, unaware of the tragedy that haunted the man behind the character. At home, he found solace in family. His daughter Courtney, whom he shared with Natalie, remained his greatest source of comfort, but even she struggled with the shadow cast by her mother's death. In interviews, she described her father as protective, loving, but forever changed. The two shared an unspoken understanding that some pain is too deep to ever fully articulate. As the years turned into decades, Robert Wagner's refusal to discuss the details of that night became more than just privacy. It became his legacy. To some, it was dignity. To others, it was denial. But for Wagner himself, it was simply survival. He once said quietly to a close friend, "If I start talking about it, I'll never stop crying." And so, he didn't. Every November, Wagner still retreats from the public eye, a quiet ritual of remembrance for the woman he loved and lost. Friends say he spends the day alone, reflecting, listening to music that reminds him of their time together. To this day, he's never spoken publicly about his daughter in connection with that tragedy. Perhaps to protect her, perhaps to shield himself, because for Robert Wagner, silence has always been his only form of peace. As the years rolled by, Robert Wagner's silence became almost as famous as his career itself. Hollywood had moved on, new stars, new scandals, new headlines, but one name, one mystery, and one man's quiet refusal to speak still lingered in the background like an unfinished song. Robert Wagner, once the embodiment of charm and charisma, had grown into a figure defined by restraint. To the world, he was a legend, the man from heart to heart, the Hollywood gentleman with timeless poise. But behind the calm exterior was a story he would never tell, a truth he carried alone. And that silence, deliberate and unwavering, became its own message. For years, journalists tried to draw him out. Interviewers approached the topic carefully, as though tiptoeing through sacred ground. Each time, Wagner would smile politely, shake his head, and gently change the subject. His eyes, often kind and warm, would darken slightly, as if retreating into memories too painful to revisit. He never raised his voice, never lashed out. He simply said nothing. It wasn't defiance. It was grief. Those closest to him understood that. His wife, actress Jill St. John, once said in a rare comment, "Some things don't heal no matter how much time passes." He's lived with that loss every single day. Wagner devoted his later years to his family, quietly protecting the people he loved most, especially his daughters. He cherished them fiercely, perhaps because he knew how fragile life could be. But when it came to talking about Natalie or his daughter Courtney's connection to her late mother, he remained silent. He never wanted his daughter to grow up defined by tragedy or public curiosity. To many, that silence seemed cold, even suspicious. But to those who knew him best, it was an act of love. Protecting Natalie's memory meant refusing to let her final moments become tabloid fuel. Protecting his daughter meant shielding her from the endless cycle of speculation that surrounded her mother's death. And so, for more than 4 decades, he stayed quiet. In that silence, though, there was something profound, a reflection of what fame often forgets, that behind every headline is a human heart, and behind every mystery is a family still trying to heal. Wagner's decision not to speak wasn't just about avoiding pain. It was about preserving what little dignity tragedy had left behind. When he did speak publicly, in his rare interviews or at charity events, he focused on the good, his enduring gratitude for his career, his pride in his children, his love for Jill. He spoke of resilience, of forgiveness, of finding light after darkness. "Life teaches you how to survive," he once said softly. "But it doesn't promise that survival will be easy." As time passed, the public's curiosity softened into respect. Younger generations discovered his work through streaming platforms and tributes, often unaware of the storm that had defined so much of his private life. To them, Robert Wagner was simply a Hollywood gentleman, polished, professional, and timeless. Yet to those who remembered, the mystery remained unsolved. Not because the truth was hidden, but because maybe, just maybe, some truths aren't meant to be told. In his twilight years, Wagner has rarely been seen in public. Now in his 90s, he lives quietly, surrounded by the people who matter most. Friends say he spends much of his time reflecting, enjoying peaceful mornings, and staying close to family. He's not haunted by guilt, they insist, but by love. A love that ended too soon, and memories too powerful to put into words. Perhaps that's why, after all this time, he still refuses to speak about his daughter, because to do so would mean revisiting everything he's tried to let rest. The grief, the speculation, the night that changed everything. His silence isn't an absence of emotion. It's the purest expression of it. In the end, Robert Wagner's legacy won't just be measured by his films or his fame. It will be remembered through the quiet dignity with which he carried the unbearable weight of loss. His silence, more eloquent than any confession, has become his final statement. A reminder that even legends bleed, even icons grieve, and even the most beautiful love stories can end in heartbreak. As one of his friends once said, he didn't stop speaking because he had nothing to say. He stopped because no one could ever understand what it cost him to keep living. And so, Robert Wagner remains silent, not because he's hiding something, but because sometimes silence is the only way to honor what words could never heal.